Professor Stiglitz, this is a perfect time to have this conversation, right? We've been talking about Trump 2.0 presidency, what that can mean for the U.S. economy all day. And I want to start there because just before the election, you, along with 22 other Nobel economists, you signed a letter saying that the Harris agenda was, quote, vastly better for the U.S. economy compared to the Trump agenda. Why are Trump and his policies not supportive or not as supportive of a strong U.S. economy?
Where do I begin? But let me, well, you have to begin somewhere. So the first thing, you know, Americans have been concerned about inflation. Actually, during the Biden administration, the inflation rate came down from the very high level that was a result of the pandemic and then the war in Ukraine, and it's come back to normal level. It's remarkable. Most economists didn't think it was going to happen so quickly, but it did. I was one among those that argued that it was a supply side interruption, demand shifts associated with these events, and that it would come down. In some ways, I had more faith in the markets than the people in the markets did. Mm. So take that issue of inflation. Trump has promised, and remember, we can't be sure he's going to deliver on anything because if you add up all the promises, they don't add up. But if he actually delivered on the 100% tariffs on Chinese goods, you think of all the apparel, appliances, all the things, iPhones, you know, smartphones, all the things we buy that either buy directly from China or have a lot of Chinese inputs. That's inflationary, 100% tariff. And even if many firms move to other places like Mexico, and the reason they chose in China was because it was cheaper. So it will be inflationary. And then you start thinking of the inflationary spiral, the prices go up, workers will want more wages, and then you start thinking of what happens if others retaliate. And remember, he's promised tariffs not only against China, which he sees as an enemy, but against all our allies as well. And they might retaliate. So first you have the inflation problem. And then, because the Federal Reserve will be worried about inflation, and Jay Powell, I've criticized him on many grounds, but what's very clear, he's announced he's not resigning. He's very focused on inflation. If inflation goes up, he's going to raise interest rates. Now, you combine the higher interest rates and the retaliation from other countries, you're going to get a global slowdown. And so then you have the worst of all possible worlds, inflation and stagnation, slow growth. And then you start thinking of just one more. I could go on, but he says he's going to start not only restricting immigration, but deporting undocumented immigrants. We here in New York know how much we depend on them. You know, we're going to go into, I can't imagine what's going to happen when that, to our economy when that happens. But one thing we can be sure, it will be inflationary.
Okay, so I do want to pick up on that point because we did have Fed President Neil Kashkari here about an hour ago. He did say that tariffs, it would be a one-time increase of prices, but that the real issue would be if we did see that tit for tat. So when you think about the globalization risks around tariffs, how do you view those comments and what could potentially come ahead?
Oh, I think this is a real challenge to the global order, a global order that's already at a point of fragility. So since World War II, we've worked very hard to construct a global order where goods, services, people, capital move more easily across borders. And it has a lot of downsides, and I've written about that in my book, Globalization and Its Discontents. But it's also contributed to some extent to global prosperity. Now, the big point to realize that whatever your judgment about the extent to which it's contributed to global prosperity, when you try to unscramble a scrambled egg, you have problems. It may not be possible, but the fact is that breaking these relationships, at least in the short run, is likely to impose very high cost. We had a little sample of that during the pandemic. Supply chains broke down. Not because we actually did say certain things couldn't go across borders, but in other cases they couldn't produce them because of the pandemic. But the fact of the matter is supply chains broke down, and look what happened. We had this bout of inflation, and we had shortages, a kind that we never had before. So I think those kinds of things are on the horizon if, and this is a big if, he actually does what he says. Now, we saw from Trump the first term that there's often a difference between the bark and the bite. That in this case, there's a real problem. What happens on tariffs is that the government announces that it's going to raise tariffs, then all the people who are affected, people, when I say corporate interests, big people, not you and me, but corporate interests come in and say, this is going to be disaster. Walmart, I'm sure, will come in and say, we have a whole store, our whole business model is importing Chinese goods, apparel, and you're going to kill us. And then a car company comes in and says, look, we use Chinese steel, or steel from Canada, or parts from Canada. You can't do this, they'll say. And then there'll be a quiet system that had happened before of what are called carve-outs. So you say, oh, this guy is exempt and that guy is exempt, but I can bet that the carve-outs will come more readily to those who make bigger campaign contributions and support Trump more. And we are about to open up the largest potential for corruption that our country has had since Andrew Jackson. So,
are you alluding to someone in particular, Elon Musk, perhaps?
Well, Elon Musk has sort of become a symbol for this kind of lack of understanding of conflicts of interest and the borders between private and public. One thing going around the internet recently, he claims to be a libertarian. He forgets that Tesla only survived because of a $500 million loan from the U.S. government, where the U.S. government gave them a loan without taking any of the upside. And like they did when they lent money to Chrysler, they took some of the upside with what they call warrants. If they had done that, we, the taxpayers, would be much better off. But in the story that's going around Twitter feed and all, the social media, and I can't tell you whether it's true, is that he said to the Europeans, if you try to regulate Twitter in the way that you are, that's called the Digital Services Act, it's trying to stop all the digital harms, and they've had it in place now for a while. If you don't give us an exemption, we're going to withdraw from NATO. Now, can you imagine that? Saying, unless you serve my corporate interest, we're going to let Poland and all those countries be run over by Russia. Now, that just, to me, illustrates that there's no boundaries between somebody who is advancing his corporate interest and the national interest.
So it seems like you don't think Elon Musk would be good for government, but isn't there a thought process where we need these provocative upper echelon of folks? I mean, politics aside, Elon Musk has brought EV adoption to the US. He's doing some innovative things with Starlink. If we want to be the best economy in the world, how do you rationalize that with, kind of to your point, the corporate greed and the short-term greed of it all as well?
I think we have a wealth of good, honest entrepreneurs that don't necessarily take huge amounts from the U.S. government and then pretend to be libertarians. You know, to me, this kind of person who takes all this money from the government and then says, I believe government should be small. What he's saying is, I think government should be small when it comes to the small guy, but big for big guys like me. That's what he's really saying. And you ask, you know, are there a lot of honest entrepreneurs out there? Yeah, there are. Are there a lot of entrepreneurs who are thinking intellectually consistently about the real needs of the country? We need to have, for instance, you know, 100 and some years ago, Henry Ford produced a car for the people. And in Germany, you had the Volkswagen, which was a car for the people. Not for the very rich, not the Cadillacs, but for the ordinary people. It transformed America by having a car that was for the people. Tesla is not for the people. You look at the prices. BYD, the Chinese company, has figured out how to make an electric vehicle. It's innovated, make an electric vehicle that is for everybody. That is transformative, and that will help the planet in a way that Tesla won't.
So you mentioned Henry Ford. Is there any current entrepreneur that you can think of today that is for the people? And if you can't easily think of one, what does that say about the current place of our economy?
Oh, I think there are a lot of, you know, entrepreneurship going all over the country. Just think of what has happened to the cost of renewable energy. That didn't happen on its own. It's fallen by 80, 90% and put us in a place that we can address the problems of climate change. That didn't happen on its own. It happened partly with government-supported research, but it happened by a lot of entrepreneurs. And sometimes we think of always that the big entrepreneur, but innovation occurs, you know, I've studied a lot of innovation in the last 50 years. Most of the important innovations are small incremental changes, one building on the other. You know, and my view, each of them should get credit, but that's the way our society advances, step by step. I mean, and then occasionally there are grand things, but it's step by step. And I think we put too much, we're too focused on the stars and not on that incremental change that really is transformative.
And I want to talk about the resiliency of the U.S. economy today, because in the face of a lot of obstacles, high interest rates included, we have GDP strong, we have unemployment low, stocks are at record highs. So when you think about the current state of our resiliency, even if Trump were to enact all the policies that he promised on the campaign trail, is there a scenario where the economy can continue to be resilient?
If he actually delivers on all his promises, I don't think the economy will do well. I mean, just think, you know, no matter what lens you look at the economy, you know, I talked about inflation, I already talked about unemployment, about the stress that's going to happen when we have a labor shortage, you have prices going up. Many other economists, this is Yahoo Finance, you think about finance, and his promises are that have been estimated to lead to an increase in the debt of over $7 trillion. And even in a rich country, $7 trillion is money. And even if you individually don't think it's a problem, you can just use it out of your bank account. The fact is, if other people think it's a problem, if foreigners think it's a problem, it becomes a problem. And I can tell you, a $7 trillion hole in the US budget, people will think is a problem.
Is that the first shoe to drop then? In other words, what type of data points should we be watching for if there's any type of deterioration of the economy?
Well, I think already what you're beginning to see is increase in the interest rates at the long end. You know, the Fed does the short end, the short-term interest rates, but people looking forward down the line are beginning to see interest rates going up. And that is already a sign. Now, how would that translate? Well, higher long-term interest rates, higher long-term mortgage rates, less housing. We already have a problem of housing prices. And so that will be one of the ways it's going to show. Now, higher interest rates is almost surely not going to be good for the stock market. So, well,
which we know President
all of you
Trump
guys
wants.
who depend on the stock market, I would say, get worried. Or take your money out, and then, of course, that's a self-feeding process. So that's another dimension where it will show up. When it will show up, you know, can't tell.
So even amid all these risks, there are some that say the soft landing scenario has already been achieved. And I'm curious to get your perspective, because you were in the White House as the U.S. orchestrated its last successful soft landing in the mid-1990s. Are the dynamics of that time similar to the dynamics of today? And are there any lessons learned that we can look back at?
Well, the particular circumstances of this, you can say, crisis, the high inflation following the pandemic, the high oil prices following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, are really idiosyncratic. I mean, are a really unusual situation. Every big crisis is unusual, you know, and a lot of the economic models don't really incorporate the notion that every big fluctuation, big downturn, inflation, has its own particular characteristics, and therefore it has to be addressed with the wisdom of what we've learned from many such cycles, but with an understanding that there are important differences. So what I emphasized before, the reason that the inflation came down and we had a soft landing in the United States was partly that it was a supply-side driven inflation, which was naturally self-correcting. I think the Fed raised interest rates too much, and we would have had a harder landing except for what happened on the fiscal side. And that was a little bit of luck. That is to say, we needed to do something about infrastructure. We needed to do something about restoring national sovereignty, economic sovereignty through the CHIPS Act and the Science Act. We needed to do something about environment, and we passed the IRA Act. Each of those were really hard. And you know, if you remember the politics of that, it wasn't obvious that we were going to get those bills. And when we passed the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, no one knew for certain how many companies were going to take advantage of it. And the CBO that estimates the extent to which people would take advantage of it estimated that the IRA was going to cost something like $350 billion on the tax credits, and now it's estimated to be somewhere between $1 and $1.5 trillion. So that pumped more money in the economy. So what you had is, in my judgment, two things balancing off. The Fed made a mistake. It raised interest rates too much. If they, but at the same time, we had an extraordinarily strong fiscal policy, and those two, it was luck to some extent that we've had the soft landing.
So we're in the soft landing right now.
We are in the soft landing, but it ends on January 20th. And that's when we start getting into a harder place where we don't actually know where we're going to go. That uncertainty, by the way, is not good for the economy. Uncertainty fiscally, uncertainty about the international situation. That's not, investors don't like that kind of environment. And if we recall the chaos of the previous Trump administration, I don't think that uncertainty is going to go away quickly.
Well, we'll have to leave it there. We'll have to get you back here to discuss this. Professor Stiglitz, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.